So just to set another ground rules, this is the second episode of this particular series, Did Jesus Claim to be God from the Gospel of John? And there's this scripture that I love so much that I would like to share with you guys before we go into the exegesis of the Gospel of John. So just hang in there, chill out. We're going to get into it and you're going to love it. And this scripture is found in the book of 1 Peter 3 verse 15, where the Bible was talking about the fact that it said, revere Christ in your heart, but always be ready to give an answer to those who ask you about the reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect. The first part and the last part, which is basically revere Christ in your heart and doing our answer giving to people with gentleness and respect, is quite important. So I wouldn't like you guys to weaponize this particular content or this particular series on the claims of divinity of Christ for you to be rude or for you to show people with certainty, because that's not the goal. The goal is to be able to give an answer with gentleness and respect on account of our reverence to Christ in our hearts. So we do not prove God by feelings. We do not prove God by, oh, my pastor said, or my bishop said, or my priest said this, but we prove God by looking at what God has revealed in scripture, because the scripture gives clear criteria itself and the scripture can speak for itself on this particular matter. So one of the things I'm going to say is that there are certain essential properties that God of necessity must possess in order for him to be God. And this is based on what we've seen from scripture, and we can basically rely on those as the metrics through which we can use to prove the divinity of Christ, or that Jesus claimed to be God, or if a particular claim is actually a deistic claim or not. And one of this property is the fact that it's called the eternal existence. That is, the essential property that God must possess is eternal existence. That is, God does not begin, but is simply his. If you look at the book of Psalm 90 verse 2, you're going to see this clearly. Another essential property is that God is a creator of all things, that God alone creates. Everything else is created. So if you can establish that Jesus is the creator of all things and that only God alone creates, this is a prerogative that belongs only to God, and everything else is created, but Jesus is not a created divine person, you have successfully been able to establish that Jesus is God. And we can see this from Isaiah 44 verse 24. And also the topic of an essential property is the divine nature and not just divine authority. We know that Jesus has divine authority on account of the fact that he submits to the Father, but Jesus is not just from God in terms of him having authority, but he also shares within the divine nature and the divine being of the Father and of the Spirit. And also worthiness of worship, that is, worship only belongs to God, as we see in Isaiah 42 verse 8. And also the revealer of God. The Bible was saying something interesting in the book of Exodus 33 verse 20, which is basically no one can fully know God unless God reveals himself. And that's the summary. And Jesus was making them to understand the fact that he is the full revelation of the Godhead. And this is quite interesting because it's a metric that is important in the essential property. So if Jesus lacks any of these, the claim of his divinity collapses. So how John does this is quite intentional. It does not start with the birth of Jesus. It does not start with the story of the virgin conception, as it were, but it starts with creation. So John's argument is actually cumulative and not an emotional argument. And when we begin to dive into it, you are going to see it clearly that John portrays who Jesus is, what Jesus does, and how scripture already spoke about him from the Old Testament. So John is not trying to invent a new belief system. He's just showing Jesus fits the Old Testament definition of God in accordance to these essential properties that I've actually listed. So hang in there, stay tuned. And the next video is going to be about we diving into the book of John 1 for us to see certain things that John has written in order for him to show who Jesus is, what Jesus does, and how scripture actually embellished the fact that Jesus is God by claiming some of these essential properties. Cheers. Give a follow and hang in there. Take care.